name's Snehal,
Snehal. Okay.
calling in from San Francisco.
All right, great. Well, we appreciate Snehal. We appreciate first time. I should have a gong. First time sponsor. We're thrilled to have you here, and we're grateful for your expertise that you're going to share with our community. How long? Now, tell us about Horizon 3. How did you start that? What is the deal behind this company?
Yeah, and I'll give you a little bit of context, kind of my background and the impetus. So first, I'm a practitioner at heart. I was the former CIO at GE Capital, actually working out of Chicago. So I was at Monroe and Canal, living in Lincoln Park, kind of making the commute down the Brown line.
Yep.
And so
Did that
having
myself.
yeah, exactly. And having been a former CIO, I've been in the seat of both reporting up to and explaining to leadership on our security posture, our digital modernization and transformation posture. How do we improve our technology fundamentals so we can use tech to drive revenue? Kind of my bag there. I left GE and became the CTO at Splunk and helped grow and scale the company for a few years. I then took a break.
Splunk
Yeah, that was fun. And I then after Splunk, I took a break from industry to serve in national security. And so I spent the last couple of years working counterterrorism amongst other things. And in all of those jobs, what I realized is that attackers know more about my environment than I do, and that we're on this unsustainable trajectory from a cyber standpoint. And really the idea of Horizon 3 was, how do I look at my environment through the eyes of the bad guy? So I can use that perspective to understand my blind spots, my weaknesses, my ineffective tools and processes, and do something about it.
I love that. I love that story. I don't like the fact that there's the bad guys out there, but it's reality. So I love the fact that you are solving a specific issue to help people.
Excellent. Yep, and I appreciate it. If you guys can see me okay here?
Yeah, we see your logo.
Great. So let me.
The first slide. All right, so I'm going to mute myself. I'll see you in 20 minutes when you see my mug show up again. That's the 5-minute mark.
All right, excellent. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
So let me kind of build on the point I made in the opening here. Is that attackers know more about my environment when I was a CIO, your environment, and the roles that you're in than you do. And when you look pretty consistently at the feedback over time from a variety of inputs, whether you're a practitioner or you oversee a team of practitioners, the challenges facing organizations hasn't really changed over the last 5 years. I would be as bold as to say, I kind of feel we've wasted $1 trillion in spending on cybersecurity products, because are we really all that much more secure today than we were last year or the year before? But that's a whole nother conversation to have over a coffee. But lack of visibility, lack of automation, alert fatigue, these are problems that plagued me in 2012. These are problems that plagued me in 2019. And there are problems that will plague me in my organizations I work for and with probably in 2022 and beyond. Now, the question is, what do you do about it? And step one is you've got to understand, how is it that attackers behave and operate? And a couple of stats that blew me away as I really dove into this offensive side of security. 80% of attacks today don't use CVEs or vulnerabilities or malware. And think about how much of our time and money is being spent on vulnerability management programs, on malware detection and endpoint protection, and so on. And what that means is attackers have adapted. And a concrete example here is if I wanted to attack your organization, or if NotPetya or a nation state APT wants to attack your organization, there's very simple things that they can do that don't require them to exploit any specific vulnerabilities in your products. Step one is get a list of all of your employee names from LinkedIn. Step two is to figure out what their likely logon user IDs are, and then start to password spray. All it takes is one employee in your company to reuse their Netflix password as their corporate email. And if you find 1,000 employee names, you will get in with 1 or 2 or 5 or 10, and it's pretty consistent as an attacker. Through credential spraying, credential stuffing, and other types of password attack techniques. Once you're in, you can pilfer, grab more usernames, grab more credentials, and rinse and repeat. Almost always you'll find an AWS token or a secret of some sort buried somewhere that was accidentally checked into your Git repository or stored in your Confluence page. And from there, you can start to traverse. And on the back end in this hybrid cloud environment, you're able to gain administrative access as an attacker by doing something as simple as many folks that run VMware and vCenter, they will keep the VM passwords as part of the notes section of the VM. And that notes section in the VM isn't encrypted in any way, it's just bad behavior. Or if you accidentally do not encrypt your VMware backups, there's a way to pull the VMware credential out of the MTD files that you have in a specific location. None of those are vulnerabilities or defects with the product. They're just misconfigurations or dangerous defaults that vendors have not appropriately hardened or put in place. If you have NetBIOS misconfigurations, you can start to grab hashes as they're being pushed around your environment through LLM&R and other techniques like that. And people think that multi-factor authentication is the end-all solution, but MFA doesn't apply to lower level protocols like SMB. And so even if you have MFA in place, which is important, you're still susceptible. And the question is, in this entire chain, and in fact, the top 10 vulnerabilities on the right that I talked about, none of those are actually CVEs. Those are misconfigurations or defaults or policy issues. And therefore, in this entire attack chain, not a single CVE or malware was actually used or exploited. And my question is, can you detect this? And how do you actually know? The second epiphany I had along the top is 93% of pen tests successfully achieve their objective in finding data worth stealing or finding or positioning yourself to disrupt your business systems. Yet, because of time and money, those pen tests only assessed about 1% of the organization. And that's because those pen tests are consultant heavy, they're very, very manual. And what that means is these problems are actually discoverable. But time and money is the limiting factor, which creates an interesting opportunity for disruption, which is kind of the area that I went after. The third part here is when you run a pen test or an offensive operation, in about 45 minutes, you have found a way to fully compromise an organization, take their data, disrupt their systems. And on average, it takes about 7 hours for their security operations center or their MSSP to actually detect presence. And in our case, in what we do in Horizon 3 is continuous automated pen testing. We're not trying to be stealthy. We are a bonfire in a public square. We hope you catch us because that proves your controls are working, yet it still took on average 7 hours. And what that means is you might have every possible security tool from every vendor, but these tools weren't designed to work together. And there's a significant burden on you as a security organization or CIO to make sure that your tools and processes are effective, and that effectiveness truly matters. So from there, kind of my realization in this journey as a practitioner is if you understand the threat landscape and this principle that attackers don't have to hack in using 0 days like in the movies. They can log in with valid credentials that they found all over the place, whether it's through open source intelligence collection or off the dark web or just through poor password policies where credentials can be brute forced. The big stat out of these key points, and we'll share the slides with you, 51% of people reuse the same password for both work and professional accounts, which makes it that much easier to apply credential stuffing and credential spraying attacks. The other 39% of accounts use passwords that never expire. And in fact, most of those accounts are service accounts that have very high privileges, which therefore means you have a very high risk of exploitation. In over 600 pen tests over the last 6 months that we've executed, the bulk of our findings have been credentials related. So you can see the things in bold. And this reiterates the fact that attackers don't have to hack in, they'll just log in. Through every pen test, at about an average 100 valid user ID passwords were collected. Many of those were domain administrator or local administrator credentials that were collected through different techniques. 1 out of every 8 hosts had a default or weak credential that provided the attacker access. And most of those credentials provided access to critical data. And final bit here, in under 2 hours with no humans involved, algorithms can attack your environment, find default credentials, in this case, to 2 SQL Server databases that led to 13 billion sensitive records at risk. Now, if we can do that as the good guys to help you find those problems and do something about it, you know for sure the bad guys have already done this and already weaponizing it. In fact, NotPetya, for instance, uses these types of techniques to propagate throughout your environment as a piece of sophisticated ransomware. That's how attacks are occurring today. Attackers don't have to hack in, they log in. But where are attacks going? And there's three interesting types of emerging attacks that are starting to occur. The first is, we see with SolarWinds the risk of a supply chain attack. We see with Visser, a manufacturer for SpaceX, the risk of third parties and their poor security and what that introduces into your overall risk posture. And we see the risk of insider threat as well, and we know that to be a big blind spot. But what's interesting is supply chain and insider starting to stack together and starting to be combined, where it looks like the SolarWinds attack was really a sophisticated insider threat because the SolarWinds company had outsourced many of their developers into Eastern Europe. It was much easier for the Russians to infiltrate the company as valid employees. And it was through that they were able to study and understand the code and then weaponize their particular attacks. So what's going to be very dangerous for organizations is not just supply chain attack, but an insider compromise within one of your suppliers that sets the conditions for a downstream attack into your organization. We saw that with Target. It wasn't an insider, but it was a third-party compromise that led to the HVAC initial access and then the Target breach from a few years ago. The second thing is further exploitation of IoT devices. That picture there is a COVID temperature sensor that many manufacturing organizations and hospitals and businesses have put in place, where as an employee badges in, they also have to have their temperatures taken to ensure that they're not symptomatic and that they can go to work. Well, vendors of those devices did a fairly sloppy job. For instance, that device, the vendor left their Android debugging bridge turned on, which meant that your service accounts to administer those devices those credentials were in the clear. So any attacker could have gained access to that service account. From that service account, they could log into your Active Directory and from there escalate by finding and gaining access to domain administrator credentials. And so as we rapidly enable IoT devices, especially in response to COVID-19, the amount of threat and risk to the network is essentially unknown. And that's in addition to large vendors like GE that are supposed to have good security hygiene in place with known default passwords that are almost impossible to undo. And that's what makes the healthcare industry in particular quite susceptible. But this expands into manufacturing and anywhere else where you see the rapid adoption of IoT devices or COVID temperature sensors and so on. The final bit here is, and this is truly emerging, is the use of AI algorithm poisoning. So I'll give you two concrete examples. The more recent one is in Hong Kong, where protesters put specific markings on their face to defeat Chinese facial recognition. Because what they realized is the way the Chinese government had trained their facial recognition algorithms, there were certain patterns in the face that would trick the algorithms into thinking nobody was there or that you were somebody else. Another example is in the UK a few years ago, some local municipality rolled out traffic cameras all over that particular area. And so when you were speeding and you drove past it, it would take a picture of your license plate, parse the text from the license plate, and basically do an insert ticket into their driving database. Well, this particular hacker thought it would be great to basically tape a SQL injection attack on his front bumper that said, select my license plate, and then drop the database table that has all of my driving record information. Nobody ever thought that particular AI algorithm and traffic camera could be used as an upstream attack to cause data destruction. And where this is important is think of banking and financial services, where banks are now using object character recognition and image recognition algorithms to verify signatures. So we're starting to see this as a way to create fraudulent business transactions through AI algorithm poisoning. Now, for me as Horizon 3, we focus on 1 and 2, in addition to some of the findings that you typically get in an automated internal pen test. So my big epiphany after, especially after looking at SolarWinds and spending time in industry, said, and time and industry being accountable for reporting to the board our security posture, is that I was tools rich, but capabilities poor. And that every good security practitioner knows compliance is not equal to security. If you are compliant, it doesn't mean you're secure. I'm sure most of the 33,000 SolarWinds victims were compliant, yet they were still exploited. I'm sure most of the healthcare companies that are being crushed with a variety of cyber attacks are compliant, but it doesn't mean they're secure. And that's a cultural point of view and a philosophy that has to be pounded into organizations. The other is a good practitioner knows the attacker will get in. And so you have to assume compromise and focus on preventing exploitation. That's the point you should be operating at. You should assume that you're going to have a compromised user. There's just too many ways for that compromise to occur. There's too many users that are poorly trained or with poor security hygiene. One of them will open up a malicious link or a malicious attachment. Insider threat is an example. They will get in or they're already in. Supply chain risk, they will get in or already in. You've got to operate assuming the attacker will get in, and now what? Most of those SolarWinds customers, for instance, and other customers that have been breached, I'm sure they all had great perimeter security, but they had a very soft, squishy center. And that is the point that attackers will exploit. Think of it as you might build a fantastic set of city walls and moats with alligators and sharks with laser beams, but all of your gold is out in the open in the middle of your courtyard. And so if you break that perimeter, parachute in or find a tunnel in, there's so many ways you could get into the middle of that courtyard. That moat and city walls didn't do you a whole lot of good. And so you've got to assume attackers have initial access. The second is more specifically, when you think about why SolarWinds as a product was selected to attack, it's because of its significant placement and access. SolarWinds had keys to the kingdom, access to almost every machine, highly privileged access. In many cases, SolarWinds had more access than any normal administrator. And there are many tools and products, especially legacy products, that require enduring credentialed access. And I think going forward, that architectural approach is dead. Think of your vulnerability scanner, for instance. It has enduring credentialed access to every single machine in your network. What if there's a supply chain attack through Qualys? We've seen through the SolarWinds reporting that at least 4 or 5 other security vendors have been compromised, because what they've realized is any product with enduring credentialed access has significant placement and access, and it is worth the effort of compromising that from a supply chain standpoint. So I think architecturally, those types of products are dead going forward, and we're going to see massive disruption in shifting away from credentialed persistent access to the organization. The second part is effectiveness is critical. Once again, you might have every tool, but how do you know that your detection and response time actually works? And the third key piece here is I think internal controls will become a much bigger focus than perimeter security, because up until now, organizations I think have either over-invested or over-focused on perimeter security at the sacrifice of internal controls and internal effectiveness. And what I think happens is, I think we shift towards this behavior of assess, detect, respond. Assess is all about continuously assessing the posture of your organization, continuously identifying exploitable attack paths that the attacker could take, and focusing your defensive efforts on stifling exploitation. The second area is how do you identify those ineffective security tools, processes, policies, and training, and how do you improve that effectiveness, which in turn improves detection time. And the third is we should expect a lot more major breaches consistently across the board throughout 21 and 22 because of what SolarWinds attackers enabled. The ability for them to borrow, the ability for them to set conditions for future attacks, and so on. And so I think we need to rethink incident response, where it's not just about forensics, which can take days or weeks to answer the question of what precisely did the attacker take. But I think there is a separate question, which is what could the attacker have taken through some sort of initial damage assessment to quickly identify potentially compromised credentials so your IT team can proactively shut them down, and potentially compromise data so your PR team and leadership can proactively and get ahead of warning and notifying customers that there could have been a data breach. So I think we're going to see an acceleration with breach response in two speeds. The initial damage assessment, which will be a slight overreaction, if you will, but it's important to overreact, and then the more precise forensics response, which is in support of a legal action. Last two slides here, and then hopefully we'll have time for questions or comments and feedback. What I would present to leadership as a CIO, no matter how awesome my roadmap was, the CEO and the board of the company would joke and say, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. I might have the best possible plan to get us to zero trust in 3 years. But if we get breached tonight, that plan doesn't matter. It was a very interesting point of view. And it got me to really think about both my strategic roadmap and my tactical cadence as a CIO. My strategic roadmap, I want to get to zero trust, for instance. But to get to zero trust requires that I have identity and access management processes in place, ITSM processes in place, enterprise logging and monitoring services in place, ABAC type services in place, because for zero trust, it's all about understanding, should I give you access to this resource based on who you are, what device you're accessing, from which location, at what time, and so on. And you need to have these underlying services in place. So that's going to take 2 or 3 years of security fundamentals to get there. But to my CEO's point, if I get breached tonight, this roadmap doesn't matter. So what I needed was a tactical cadence that I ran on almost like a daily sprint or a weekly sprint for my security teams. And every day or every week, I want to assess my security posture and assess my effectiveness and answer questions like, what are the most urgent issues I must triage or fix immediately? Am I actually getting better as I turn on these strategic roadmap capabilities? Am I improving my detection time? Am I improving my response time or my remediation time? And how do I prove it to the board to show and prove my effectiveness? What do I look like through the eyes of the attacker, and how do I mitigate and stifle recon and so on? So think of your tactical cadence with your strategic roadmap and this idea of continuous assessments. And real quick, Alex, just last two minute here. And the reason why that continuous assessment is important is if you don't continuously assess, you're accruing risk over time. You're running, for instance, an annual pen test, and you're going to clean up issues, and you're accruing risk over time. Whereas with a continuous assessment behavior, you are quickly catching problems, and over time, you're operating at a much lower level of risk and much lower level of cost as well. And that really assigns this idea of purple teaming, which is shifting from once a year or maybe once a quarter to 4 times a week. How do you run a pen test, for instance, 4 times a week with no humans in the loop to find, fix, and verify? And that's where people talk about this concept of purple teaming. We're using the red team to attack, the blue team to defend, and you're constantly improving your posture. Because our final thesis is that you need to look at your organization through the eyes of the attacker so that you can find your blind spots, prioritize your weaknesses, and improve your posture in a meaningful way and fix problems that actually matter. So thanks for the time. Sorry I went over by a couple of minutes, but I appreciate your feedback and thoughts.
No, you're fine. We got a couple minutes for Q&A, and I really go flip back a couple slides. Oh, with the right there. That's a great chart. With the not that one. That's a good one too, but the next one. With there, that's a great graph. And then the next one where the next one with the purple teams, that's a good one too. You know, I've done a lot of innovation, digital transformation conferences, and I hear a lot about the agile teaming, and they have these they call them different names. I've heard different names, squat teams, whatever, where you have people that are your best people outside of the normal organization. It sounds like that's what you're sort of applying, is you do the pen testing, and these sort of, you know, Navy SEALs, if you will, go in there and fix the vulnerabilities. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, you know, being vulnerable doesn't mean you're exploitable, and that's kind of one problem. If I run a vulnerability scanner, I'll get 100,000 findings, only 5 or 10 of which can actually be exploited by an attacker. And of those 5 or 10, maybe 1 or 2 actually lead to sensitive data exposure. or business disruption. So what you want to do is focus on what are the problems that can actually be exploited, and then how do you go fix those? And then how do you verify that those problems have truly been fixed? And in the day or two in between, when you found it and fixed it, and as you start to verify, something has changed in your environment. New patches, new configuration changes, new users with poor hygiene. And you end up finding more problems. And what we end up seeing is this daily security stand-up behavior. And that's really what we ended up focusing on. We do basically pen testing as a service. No humans, no consulting, no professional services. It is that Twilio-like self-service experience for pen testing, which has never been possible previously.
That's amazing. So what you're doing is not only continuing to test the environment for people and show them where they're both vulnerable and exposed, but you're also pointing out some of the priorities, is what you're saying.
Yeah, because you might get this arbitrary finding that says like an LDAP null bind is almost always categorized as a low or extra low. It is not a problem anyone pays attention to. But if an attacker can use that LDAP null bind to find and steal your customer data, that context matters. And you only get that context if you understand the exploitation path. And that's what we focus on, which is here is the full chain of how we were able to combine credentials we found with misconfigurations, with defaults, with vulnerabilities, and prioritize it based on business impact to you so you can fix problems that actually matter.
You'd be a good defensive coordinator. They need you in the Super Bowl. So, I got a couple quick questions, then we got to run. So, Chris asked earlier in your presentation, and we need lightning answers here. Can you please reiterate why MFA is less than effective against, what does he say here?
Yeah, so this goes kind of the point back here.
Yeah.
So lower level, so MFA, multi-factor authentication, great if you're logging in through the web page. Great if you're trying to log into your remote desktop. But, and it is going to operate at those higher level protocols that are interacting with users. But there are many much lower level protocols that operate at the machine level, like SMB. SMB cannot be multi-factor authentication enabled. And so an attacker doesn't need to try to log into the web page. If you've got SMB enabled, they're just going to log in straight through there. So MFA is important for certain parts of the environment, but it is not the end all. And you've got to realize that lower level protocols like SMB are not MFA enabled, and they still enable the attacker to get in.
That's a good answer. Yeah, thanks for that. All right, last question. Brian wants to know if my software vendor is SolarWinds, i.e. is compromised due to, as an example, SolarWinds, due to poor security controls. What can I do? How do I know if an update will I get compromised or will it fix the compromise? That's a really good question.
Yeah, so if you look at SolarWinds, and I'll keep this brief as I can.
Yeah.
The attackers intentionally had their malicious code go to sleep after you applied the patch. So that code slept for 2 weeks, meaning it never beaconed out and tried to establish command and control. And they did that intentionally to defeat your practice of taking a patch and applying it in a sandbox and monitoring and making sure it's okay. Because that's actually how like secret and top secret government organizations operate. So sophisticated attackers are going to defeat that practice of trying to catch them, which is why the best thing you can do in the SolarWinds case is focus on catch the beacon. If you can catch the beacon, that's the signature you've got to be looking for. So really doubling down on scrutinizing your DNS logs to make sure you catch any outbound beacon, assuming they will get in. And then number 2 is catch the lateral movement. If you see 2 machines starting to speak to one another and they've never spoken to each other before, that could be a lateral movement case. And then the third is lock down your credentials, your service accounts, and continuously minimize what can actually be exploited. Those are the 3 fix actions that you need to focus on.
Great advice. All right, listen, let's get to your last slide so they know how to reach out to you.
Oh yeah, sure. So horizon3.ai is the website. I'm also available. You'll find me on LinkedIn as well. And we got a Horizon 3 LinkedIn page. I've got a fairly unique name, so you can just Google me and you'll find me too. I'm easy to get in touch with. And look forward to following up with my former Chicago neighbors.
Thank you so much for doing this. We appreciate your time, and thanks for your service with all this. This is great that you're doing this for everybody.